Echo Fighters are one of the best and most underrated additions to Smash Bros. Ultimate, taking something that was commonly criticized as cheap or lazy and padding out Smash rosters with clone characters, and turning it into something that people can get excited about by slapping a fun marketing term on it that better conveys what these characters actually are. Not stealing slots and development time from new characters, but rather extra inclusions that can be added due to their lower development time that still packs the massive value proposition of giving us another brand new fighter to get excited about playing. Echo Fighters are such a popular concept and fun talking point that you'll see tons of discussion about them online, like giving every character on the Smash roster their own Echo Fighter. And yeah, I'm talking about Echo Fighters today too, although not specifically in that context. And also my recording space is not usable right now, so for today I'm going to be one of those YouTubers that talks to you via a picture. Hello. While I truly love Echo Fighters conceptually, I don't think we take enough time to acknowledge a harsh reality of this type of fighter, and that is that there really aren't that many viable Echo Fighters left to pull. I know that may seem absurd when you consider how many different characters get thrown around as Echo Fighters, and like I said, people are giving Echo Fighters to every character on the roster, but when you actually slow down and put those characters under the microscope, you might be surprised at how many don't end up qualifying to meet the needs of an Echo Fighter. Note that I won't be going over every single popular Echo Fighter idea in this video for the sake of time, but we are going to be taking a look at some of the most prominent examples to help explain why it could be so hard to hit that Echo Fighter Goldilocks zone. There's really two main reasons most ideas for Echo Fighters fail to be viable, and we're going to go over those right now. Number one, they don't do the same things. While Echo Fighters can take great liberties in areas like animation, when it comes to the actual gameplay and moves they perform, they have to be very similar to their base fighter. The majority of Echoes perform all of the same basic moves, and the Echoes that do deviate do so in very minimal ways, like Chrom getting a different up B than Roy, though still an up B that is using a sword. There are many proposed ideas for Echo Fighters that get close to the base fighter, but when we're talking about Echoes, close usually isn't close enough. Take Wart, for example, the main antagonist of Super Mario Bros. 2, commonly proposed as an Echo Fighter for Bowser. They carry a similar large, overbearing, lumbering build to them, but issues quickly present themselves when you look at attacks. Sure, it might seem easy to replace Bowser's Fire Breath with some sort of Bubble Breath, but you're already asking for a completely unique particle system to be made for this Echo Fighter, and that's not even taking into account that that's not really how bubbles work with Wart. Not to mention any attack Bowser does that requires his shell, either for attack or for retreat, Wart doesn't really have a way to substitute those attacks cleanly. And once we're talking about having to replace multiple moves with completely new attacks, the case for being an Echo gets harder and harder. Another example is Rock Howard, the adoptive son of Terry Bogard, and commonly proposed to be an Echo Fighter of Terry Bogard. This despite the fact that Rock Howard has his own relatively unique moveset, including unique special moves from Terry, and even if you want to make the argument that Rock Howard could reasonably perform the same moves as Terry, as he is his son, it's so core to the character of Rock Howard that he's using a moveset that combines his biological father Geese with his adoptive father Terry, and taking that away from him just to make him an Echo Fighter feels like misrepresentation to a point that it's not viable. And as a quick final example, I can understand why it can be tempting to say that the protagonists of Xenoblade games can be Echo Fighters of each other as they all carry a big red sword, but you don't have to play these games for long to realize that how they actually attack and how that big red sword gets used could not be more different from each other. But that's enough examples of reason one. The second reason most Echo ideas end up not being viable is that the proposed Echo Fighter does not fit the skeleton of the base fighter. You could think of skeletons in game development just like skeletons in real life, sort of the basic structural architecture that the character model needs to fit around to help it animate properly. All Echo Fighters have to use the same skeleton as the base fighter. That is absolutely foundational to what makes them so easy and time-saving to develop, because that allows the team to reuse animations or just subtly adjust animations on the same skeleton, rather than having to create a whole new skeleton, which would then require having to create create new animations for that skeleton, suddenly creating a significantly higher animation workload. There are plenty of examples I can point to of this holding back potential Echo Fighters. I think about Nemesis as an Echo Fighter for Byleth. Nemesis is this massive, broad-shouldered square of a man, compared to the much skinnier, typically proportioned Byleth. But honestly, the only example I need to demonstrate Echo Fighter ideas that fail on the level of the character skeleton is 90% of the Echo Fighters people propose for Pokemon. Pokemon are all shaped so uniquely and so differently that getting any two to line up, often even within the same evolutionary line, is nearly impossible. Garchomp doesn't have Charizard's tiny little arms. Grotle can't go over Ivysaur because Grotle has such a smaller head and this arched back. Ivysaur's back is relatively flat, except for the bulb, which wouldn't animate the same way as an arched back. Not all Pokemon ideas are impossible. I'll give you that Wartortle could probably go over Squirtle just fine. I just don't know why you would do that. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself with that one. Those are the two main factors that make an Echo pretty much impossible to implement. Either they can't feasibly do most of the same moves as the original fighter, or their character model could not reasonably fit on the same skeleton. But those are just the basics. That's just what makes an Echo Fighter impossible. Even if an Echo Fighter is possible, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good idea. And I do want to start talking about Echo Fighters that might actually be possible in the future. I think that's way more fun. But before we get there, I want to talk about the Echo Fighters we already have in Smash, and the reasons they became Echo Fighters in the first place. The most common reason for an Echo Fighter to be added to Smash is popularity. A character that had notable popularity, though granted maybe not quite enough popularity to become an original fighter. There's three Echoes that I think exemplify this: Daisy, Dark Samus, and Chrom. Going forward, I may be mentioning some Echoes that I think might not crack that popularity level, but I know for a fact that before Ultimate, I would have absolutely said Chrom was not popular enough to even become a clone character. Now, in my defense, Chrom was added due to popularity specifically in Japan. Obviously, I am much less aware of what's popular in Japan compared to over here, but just to acknowledge that just because I don't see a character being popular enough to be added, that is far from an objective statement, and I could easily be wrong there. The second way we see Echo Fighters get into Smash Bros. Is if they're a relatively easy add from a recent title. These are your Dark Pits and your Lucinas, characters that didn't really need to prove they could be popular, because the main reason they got added was to bolster representation for recent Nintendo games. These often end up being the most criticized Echo Fighters we see, but I don't think we're gonna stop seeing them happen because it's hard for Nintendo to predict which of their more recent characters are going to end up having longevity, and since most of us do want to see the most recent era of Nintendo represented in Smash, sometimes they do just have to roll the dice on a character because they would be particularly easy to implement. Then there's two more Echoes left who I think are added for more bespoke reasons. The easier one to explain is Ken, and Ken was added just because he is the video game Echo Fighter. Yes, he's a very beloved and popular character on his own, but more than anything, he exemplifies what Echo Fighters are. If they did not add Ken in Smash Ultimate, he would be everyone's number one expectation and probably number one want for an Echo Fighter in the future. It's literally what he is. And then there's Richter, who maybe could have gone in the popularity category, but Richter is special because it's not really about him being popular himself, it is him representing what is arguably the most popular Castlevania game, Symphony of the Night. That game and that era of Castlevania is definitely big enough to warrant representation in its own right, though since they were already adding Simon, it made sense they couldn't go the extra mile to also add Alucard as a unique character. So instead, they could easily grab the Belmont from that game, Richter, and since they were designing Simon at the same time, they could actually share moves with each other to make the Echo situation make even more sense, and that gets you some Symphony of the Night representation at the same time. That is actually a big thing that holds a lot of Echo Fighter ideas back. Richter got to take advantage of the fact that he could influence the design of his base fighter, but I think it's far less likely that they're suddenly going to go back and edit a character that's already on the roster just to allow their Echo Fighter to make more sense. So with that out of the way, we're going to start talking about characters that I actually do believe could be Echo Fighters, but lack any of that reasoning that allowed our current Echo Fighters to get into the game in the first place. I like to call this section the why bother tier. Maybe these characters work as Echoes, but literally why bother? Characters like Chunky Kong, everyone's 8th favorite member of the Kong family. Does he fit the best as a Donkey Kong Echo? Maybe. But I just don't think that character, or frankly even the game he came from, has the clout to justify even Echo Fighter development time. Kumatora or Paula are frequently mentioned as Echo Fighters of Ness and Lucas, but again, I don't think those characters are popular enough in their own right to justify it. They certainly don't have modern relevance, and I don't think their inclusion on the roster adds anything of notable value over Ness and Lucas, except for the option to play as a female variant. The Mother series may be popular enough in Japan to justify Echo Fighters just on that basis of how popular it is, but even as a huge fan of that franchise myself, I've never personally been a fan of banking on characters getting on the Smash roster just for the sake of their series having a larger character count. I feel like this section is where I really start laying out some unpopular takes you guys can tear me apart for. One of the most popular Echo Fighter ideas that I just don't understand at all is Guiji. I don't have a reason that he couldn't work, I just don't really understand why the demand is there, but if the demand stays there and you guys are loud enough, maybe you could make it happen. I'd put him as an alt costume, personally. And the last one for this section, and admittedly the one I am most worried about saying, because I know it'll upset some people, particularly fans of classic Nintendo, I would actually start to suggest that the likes of Blood Falcon or Black Shadow are starting to enter into the why bother tier. Without a big new installment, I don't really know why we would go back and give extra representation to F-Zero in this way, especially considering when we did get new F-Zero content, it was content that Blood Falcon and Black Shadow weren't really relevant to. Those of you who are really passionate about a new F-Zero inclusion might suggest that an Echo Fighter is actually the perfect way to do it, because there's pretty much no way F-Zero's getting a new original character, and since Sakurai is clearly a fan of the franchise and likely wishes it continued, maybe he could throw the franchise a bone with a Blood Falcon or Black Shadow Echo Fighter, and I won't deny you that. I think it's reasonable. I definitely have a bias towards more modern and contemporary inclusions, which pulls me away from thinking that F-Zero characters are particularly worth it, at least until that franchise comes back in a meaningful way. I have knocked out a lot of popular Echo Fighter ideas in this video, and I'm not technically done taking out Echo Fighter ideas, but I do think we're getting into more positive territory the deeper we go. The last section was characters who I do believe work as Echo Fighters, I just don't think they are worth the effort. These characters, I think, could maybe be Echo Fighters, and they are worth the effort, but I actually think they would instead get in as a semi-clone, pseudo-clone, or even original character. These characters could be Echo Fighters, but I actually think they deserve more. Birdo! Let's all appreciate the fact that this is maybe the only time I'm going to be talking about Birdo in a slightly positive light. I think overhauling Yoshi's tongue attacks to be nose attacks, I guess? Suction attacks? Is actually enough effort that Birdo would be closer to an Isabelle-style semi-clone than a true Echo Fighter. And please don't give Birdo a tongue for the sake of making her an Echo. It seems tempting for a lot of people to talk about Akechi or Kasumi from Persona 5 as an Echo Fighter of Joker, probably because Joker already has an alt costume for Akechi, and there's reason to suspect they actually considered using Kasumi as a part of Joker's Challenger Pack at some point in development. The more time that passes, the more it does seem like Persona 5 is going to end up being Atlus's legacy mega hit game. We'll see if Persona 6 is able to catch up with it or even dethrone it at all, but it seems like it could be a comparable situation to what Square Enix has going on with Final Fantasy VII's legacy, so additional representation can't be out of the question. And they do have similar builds and similar-ish weapons, but it is really hard for me to imagine them using their longer swords and unique guns in exactly the same way Joker does. Dixie Kong I'm close to calling an impossible Echo Fighter because I'm not sure how well they could animate her hair around Diddy Kong's existing attacks, but that is unknown territory, it's a gray area, and ultimately they do have a very similar build, but it's hard for me to imagine Sakurai including Dixie Kong and not utilizing her hair or anything else that makes her unique. Dixie Kong, from her introduction, behaved completely differently from Diddy Kong. This is a good time to mention that the reason I think so many of these Echo Fighters are unviable, even if they could technically fit over the model and perform a lot of the same moves, is that I think Sakurai himself does not particularly like resorting to Echo Fighters or even clone characters if he can avoid it. I really think the days of putting Ganondorf as a Captain Falcon clone have haunted him ever since, as evidenced by the fact that the next game in the franchise, Brawl, made more efforts to declone characters than any game in series history, and no game since Melee has introduced clones in such heavy volume until Ultimate, where they specifically created the Echo label to alter the narrative and put more definitive rules around what kind of characters get this really low budget, easy development kind of treatment. I know Smash fans kind of clam up when you use the word rules, and I'm not suggesting there are hard rules with Echo Fighters, I definitely think they're not, but I do think there is a general soft rule that Echo Fighters need to be in some way easier to develop, or else they don't get made. That is, like, literally the point of them. That being said, I don't think Sakurai would put Akuma on another Echo slot along with Ryu and Ken. Even if you start to include his bare essentials like the different ways his Air Hadoken works or his Air Tatsu, I think you start to push the boundaries of Echo Fighter even more than Ken did. I think the team would much sooner choose to make Impa a unique character or at very least a pseudo-clone, especially when you consider Zelda's sort of rocky reputation in Smash Bros. For just being a bunch of different incarnations of the same character. But the biggest example of a character that I see people say could be an Echo, and they may not be wrong, but I think absolutely deserves more, and I think the Smash team would agree with me, is Shadow the Hedgehog. Shadow is honestly in the running for the most popular Japanese video game character who is not yet on the Smash roster. While I won't say it's impossible for him to be an Echo, I do think going that route would be pretty much a direct repeat of making Ganondorf a Melee clone back in Melee, which is something I don't think Sakurai would be too keen on repeating. If you can't tell, we're definitely getting into more and more gray area as this video goes on. I've likely mentioned an Echo so far that you disagree with my assessment of and think that they're a way more viable Echo than I'm giving them credit for, which is totally fine, by the way. Hope you're enjoying the chance to deep dive into some niche Smash conversation anyway. Hope you like the video if you do. But now we're finally gonna start talking about characters that I can kinda shake on. Now we're going to talk about characters that, with modification, I can see it. They may not be a perfect one-to-one Echo situation like Daisy or Richter, but the changes they do need are changes that other Echo Fighters have gotten already. Characters like Peppy Hare and Slippy Toad. Make one an Echo for Fox, one an Echo for Falco. It's far from the most ideal way to represent these characters, but I think all you need to make them read as the character is have them animate in ways that complement their personality. Make Slippy a little less precise and more chaotic, make Peppy a little more controlled, reserved, less energetic. That said, it's not like Peppy and Slippy literally do fight the same as Fox and Falco, more like they just reasonably could. I would like them to lean more semi-clone personally, but I understand that these characters might not necessarily warrant that much work. That's why they got as far along in this video as they did. Funky Kong is an Echo Fighter that I kinda rub up against because I don't love the idea of Funky Kong not integrating any of his unique traits like a surfboard or some sort of rocket barrel into his moveset. But he has already been used as a stand-in for Donkey Kong in other games, and they can absolutely just throw the surfboard in a taunt or a victory screen, maybe turn his rocket barrel plane into some sort of final smash. All changes that plenty of Echo Fighters have made already. Raichu gets very close to being off-model for me because of how different the tail is, but when I think about how infrequently Pikachu actually uses its tail for attacks, I think they could work around it. Also, I just really like Raichu. I like the idea of completing sets in Smash. That's why I was pretty okay with them bringing Chrom in, even though Awakening does not need 3 characters. At least they completed the trio, and I think it'd be cool to complete the trio of Pikachu evolutions. Just how my brain works. Now, before we get to the grand finale of this video, where I talk about the Echo Fighters that I think are completely viable with zero compromise, there is one more category I want to mention, but I don't want to take up too much time with. And that is different versions of the same character. We've never really seen Echo Fighters used in this way before. Think of like putting Dry Bowser as an Echo Fighter for Bowser, or Evil Ryu as an Echo of Ryu. And I really like this idea. I think Smash should embrace having different versions of characters where it makes sense to do that. But I like that idea so much, it's actually maybe worth a separate video entirely, and we've never seen Echo Fighters used as a way to bring in alternate versions of the same character, so it felt a bit outside the scope of this video. But let's get to it, and finally talk about the 6 characters that I think perfectly work as potential Echo Fighters for the next game. And by the way, this list is relatively complete to me. I really racked my brain on this one, and in the end, these are the only 6 characters that I am confident to propose as Echo Fighters with very minimal asterisks behind them. Though I am going to group them into 2 separate categories, you'll see why in a minute. First, this is not part of the 6. I would just like to give sincere apologies to Ms. Pac-Man. You absolutely should and probably would be an Echo Fighter if you didn't have all of your weird legal troubles holding you back. you are not a member of this list. First up, one of the easiest Echo Fighters to translate, Zack Fair as an Echo Fighter for Cloud. Not only do they look nearly identical, but there's no reason to believe that Zack couldn't do all of the same things that Cloud does. I don't think it would be too weird to see Zack doing Cloud's limit breaks, and with how many Echoes get unique final smashes, we could still reserve Omni Slash just for Cloud, and give Zack something more specific to him. Next up is Jeanne from the Bayonetta series. Apologies in advance if I said that name wrong. All these years later, still not certain the right way to say it, but she is a very traditional rival character similar to Dark Pit or Dark Samus. Doing all of Bayonetta's stuff is kinda her thing. It's a very natural transition. And following this exact same framework, I want to talk about Metal Sonic, who is essentially exactly the same as the Dark Samus situation. The actual functionality of the moves can all be identical to Sonic, but the vibe and animations the character does would create an entirely different energy around him. Maybe you've noticed why I've grouped the first three in this section together. They are all third-party characters, and that's something I haven't addressed in this video yet. As you likely already know, it's reasonable to assume that any third-party character is going to be more challenging to put in Smash than a first-party character. The most famous example is how much Sakurai has struggled to get content from Square Enix into Smash Ultimate, which would include Zack Fair. Because this video is just about their viability as an Echo Fighter, I decided to just ignore the complexities of specifically getting third-party characters in Smash, as that is not exclusively an Echo issue. Except for Miss Pac-Man, who, as I understand it, is just actually impossible. The remaining three Echo Fighters we're going to talk about are first party, meaning they hit every note I've talked about throughout this entire video that were holding other Echo choices back. That includes easily fitting the skeleton, doing all the same moves, having some sort of special reason to warrant their development time in the first place while not being so popular that they deserve even more than an Echo, and they're not even being held back by the vague, nebulous limitations of being a third party. The three characters that I think make the most sense to be Echo Fighters are Louie from Pikmin, an ongoing series that, while modest, does seem to be growing in overall popularity, and Olimar and Louie continue to be center points of the franchise. All the Pikmin captains are basically the same in gameplay, so there's not really a reason to create a whole unique character for another Pikmin captain. But even if we just take Louie as a pure echo of Olimar, and all you do is you swap out the purple Pikmin for, let's say, rock Pikmin, and they behave virtually the same way, maybe some values tweaked here and there, already you've created a valid echo and representing another captain, another Pikmin type. I think that is a ton of added value for way less effort than a lot of other echoes would demand. Next up is Ninten as an Echo Fighter of Ness. Honestly, he could also just be an alternate costume of Ness, but it's way more popular to suggest he would be an Echo. And this is another one that I think requires very little effort. I don't think there's a lot that people actually want Ninten to do differently from Ness. They just want the character represented. Remember how I said that I really enjoy when we complete collections in Smash Bros. And the Mother games continue to be extremely popular games in Japan even all this time later. Because of this, I think Mother has much more reason to vie for additional representation on the Smash roster, compared to series that I do not feel have held on to their legacy as strongly, such as F-Zero, and I believe Ninten brings more singular value as an inclusion in completing the Mother trilogy on the Smash roster, compared to the Mother characters I discussed earlier in the video, whose merits for inclusion felt a little more dubious or just vague at worst. I think that is a perfect example of having something worth representing on the roster, but not nearly worth the effort of a brand new character. And on a similar note, we only have one Echo Fighter left to talk about, who I think is the most interesting character in this entire video, because it's a character that I think most people just assume is a lock for the next Smash game one way or another, but it's a character that could be an Echo, a semi-clone, an all-new original character, or even just an alt costume. And that's the Octoling. And honestly, an Echo Fighter might make the most sense for them. In the Splatoon games, the Octoling is just an aesthetic change. They function the same as the Inklings, so you might think they might make the most sense as an alt costume. And that could definitely work. But with how massive of a franchise Splatoon is, I do think it reaches a territory where you have to consider ways to inject new, exciting Splatoon content into Smash Bros. Just for the sake of exciting and energizing that fan base to be excited to play the new Smash Bros. And maybe Octolings could be upgraded all the way to semi-clone or original character to serve that purpose, but I think making them an Echo Fighter so they can have their own 8 original alt costumes and just swapping out their weapons for different weapons that perform similar roles, such as just switching out the ink brush for the Octo Brush, is a great middle ground between acknowledging their similarities to Inkling while also giving them something a little extra special to acknowledge how big they are and their series is. And there you have it. That's why when you get right down to it, I don't think there's actually a very big list of characters who are viable as Echo Fighters and earn the exact development time of an Echo Fighter. These are just my ideas, and with how popular of a topic Echo Fighters are, there is no way you didn't come into this video with your own ideas. Feel free to share them below. Take care, more videos coming soon.